Welcome back to another episode of Lost in the Farmer's Market Garden Shorts, where today we will be covering one of the major garden food staples of the world. What you see before you is a potato plant. The variety is Red Norland, which makes it a red-skinned potato. It's essentially a white potato with a red skin. And its scientific name is Solanum tuberosum. I should note that it has too many synonyms to list in this video. I mean, potatoes have been renamed a lot. Now, that means, the name Solanum, it means that it is a part of the family Solanaceae, which is the Nightshade family, which includes tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, wonderberry, ground cherries, goji berries, amazingly, and a few other things. White potatoes originate in what is modern-day Peru. So that's South America. They are hardy, they are an annual in zones 3 to 10, and then potentially a perennial in warmer climates than zone 10. They prefer a soil pH between 5 and 6, and a sun exposure of full sun. They're not like tomatoes where they prefer afternoon sun. Full sun is best. It also makes it easier to pick off one of their biggest pest problems, but I'll get to the pest problem in a moment. The stalks can get to 2 feet high with not much of a width, usually maybe 18 inches if it's multi-stemmed, depending on how many eyes come out of an individual slip. Now, a slip is a chunk of potato with a growing point on it. The growing point, before it swells and expands and starts to grow, looks kind of like a drawing of an eye, and henceforth why they're called eyes. Now, they have nicknames: Spud, Tater, Murphy, Bastard Potato, and Virginia Potato. I don't know where the name Murphy comes from. I've been looking into that, and I can find no source, but it is repeated in multiple articles, so I presume it to be for real. Bastard Potato, that must be referring to a particular variety, but it comes up in a bunch of historical documents, which is bizarre. The Virginia potato, I'm not sure, but that may also be a variety or specific localized regional type. Now, when it comes to potatoes, all green parts are toxic. They have a compound called solanine, which is common in the Solanum family. Much like the greens of tomatoes are not good for you to eat, I don't believe the greens of eggplants are safe to eat. I don't know about pepper greens. Not sure. But the problem with the greenness is that the tubers, the spuds from which they generate, plants, as you can see in our little specimen plant here, are, once the spuds have been exposed to light, underneath whatever color the skin is, there can be this green layer, and that green layer produces solanine, which means that a potato that has been out in the sun may make you sick. So you have to be careful of that. Additionally, potatoes that are decaying will rapidly ferment, which can be a problem for livestock who happen to find them and eat them, or eat the greens, or the green parts that have become green because they're attempting to grow. Now, the word potato itself is from patata, Spanish, and that is a hybrid between batata, which is from the Taino people, forgive me if I mangled that name, and papa, which is quencha. Again, forgive me if I mangled that. And so it's actually a combination of two indigenous words. That was my phone. Please ignore that. The flower color tends to match the color of the skin of the potato, which is interesting. So if it's something like a russet, the flower is going to be white. If it's something like a red Norland potato, it might be pink. If it's one of those blue-skinned or purple-skinned, it's going to be a purplish flower. There are more than 5,000 varieties known, which is amazing, and they've all been bred for colors, shapes, sizes, fingerling potatoes, large Yukon Gold potatoes, which will have a sort of yellowish kind of flower. There's a potato to meet every fancy. There's just one catch. They're usually packed with starches, which can aggravate diabetes. Now, what we do know is that these plants may have been hybridized from a common ancestor, Solanum brevical, which is poisonous. However, it does produce tuberous growths. So The genotyping is not exactly clear, but it is believed that that is their common ancestor and it may have been crossed with something else. Obviously, written records from the time period of the hybridization don't exist because that occurred in Mesoamerica possibly before written record was a thing. We do know that it was domesticated between 8,000 and 5,000 BCE. That's before the Common Era. Now, as far as nutrition is concerned, per 170 grams of potato, there are 10 milligrams of sodium, 716 milligrams of potassium, which is amazing. I mean, who knew? You'd think potatoes were nutritionally bereft, and then they got that potassium. 30 grams of carbohydrates, partially in the form of starches. 55% of your daily dose of vitamin C, 2% of your calcium, 7% of your iron, 25% of B6, and 9% of magnesium. So it turns out potatoes are actually nutritious. They're just not a complete meal, which is fascinating. Now, I do have to talk about one thing here. The Irish potato famine. It's a historical moment in time that is a tragedy. Dare I say, it was the Irish Holocaust, because it was an unfortunate happening that was aggravated by actions or inactions of the British government. Now, to understand that, you have to understand what happened to the potatoes. The Irish at the time were growing a variety called the Irish lumper, which was cultivated prior to 1840. This particular variety would flourish in poor soil or wet soil, or just basic garden soil, which was a benefit. You could grow it almost anywhere in that climate. It's an old variety that, again, was noted to exist in 1808, so that's about as far back as it goes, and its description was wet, nasty, knobbly old potato, and it was probably wet and nasty because it had a uncommonly low starch content. They ironically brought this variety back as an heirloom in 2008, more to connect kids with their roots. No pun intended. Now, what caused the famine? Well, it's a fungus-like pathogen called a umicete, and I mispronounced that, I'm sure. The scientific name is Phytophthora infestans. It's a eukaryotic microorganism. Now, what's interesting about that is it's not a fungus, but it kinda is. It's got traits of fungi and bacteria going on. Some things on planet Earth defy our normal expectations. Well, anyway, it reproduces sexually and asexually. It causes late potato blight and sudden oak death. It's commonly called a water mold. Now, this pathogen, due to the fact that almost exclusively one variety of potato was being planted, this pathogen went through them like wildfire. The famine was from 1845 to 1849, with the worst year being 1847. Weather played a role in this, but also the inaction of the British government, as noted, made it worse. It's estimated that at least 1 million died directly as a result of the potato famine, and possibly more. It is the reason that there was a diaspora to America of Irish folks trying to get out of that situation. And ironically, the blight hit again in 1879, just 30 years later. From what I understand, that blight wasn't quite as bad, but it's definitely worthy of note. And that actually, if you want another good view on the potato famine and the history of the potato, you can look up the History Guy's work on that. He did a wonderful video, and I'll put a link to it down there. But anyway, that's the potatoes themselves. Now, I'm going to just quickly talk about how you grow these buggers. Now, you see my specimen right here. What you would do is you would plant the slip in a pot like this, or a shallow large pot. I have this in a starter pot because it's just convenient for demonstration purposes. You wait for the growth to come up, and then you'd move this to a larger pot, and then start backfilling soil. So once it's up to here, you backfill half of the plant underground. Grows up, backfill. Grows up, backfill. And by doing this until you reach the end of the larger pot, which should be something like a tree pot, maybe a 14, 15-inch diameter, or maybe one of those fabric pots for potatoes. You keep doing this until you get an inch on the rim of the bigger pot. Then You stake or cage the potato, so that it doesn't flop over. It also makes it easier to spot the one pest that you have to worry about, and that's Colorado potato beetles. You'll know them when you see them. They're bright orange with usually 2 spots on each wing casing. They're a true beetle, but their larvae are gross, maggoty looking things. If you get rid of the larvae, they won't be a problem. If you don't get rid of the larvae, the little maggoty things, will eat the foliage and cut down the health of your potato harvest. You can manually pick them, or you can spray them down with insecticidal soap, which is organic and ecologically safe. Beyond that, though, short of sitting in wet feet, constantly wet soil, potatoes really don't have much of a problem in growing, at least in Zone 8A. They're very successful. In fact, most of my personal harvest actually, ironically, comes out of the compost pile where they volunteered when I throw away potatoes that aren't that great, or have rotted, or have started to go gross. In terms of storage, as a final note for this video, always check your potatoes in dry storage, because once one goes bad, others will go bad with it. The juice they leak when I guess a bacterial infection damages one, can induce others to sour as well. Do not store onions with potatoes, because the chemical compounds released by the onions can spoil potatoes too. Usually have the onions on a higher tier than the potatoes, and it should be fine. With that said, this wraps up this episode of Lost in the Farmer's Market Garden Shorts, where we're covering potatoes and getting phone messages apparently. Hopefully you found this informative, and if you like this episode, like, subscribe, hit up the blog, and as always folks, keep them growing. Thanks for watching.